Okay, friends, so good evening, those who are joining from Delhi, and good morning to Ashley. And we are delighted to have him back. Last year, he was here when we had with him also Shiv Shankar Menon, Shashi Tharoor, and Professor Bhanu Pratap Mehta. So, Ashley, as they celebrate Diwali in White House nowadays, so let me wish you happy Diwali.
Now, happy Diwali to all of you.
Okay. Now, what I would do, as you have given us only 60 minutes, I will jumble together 4 or 5 questions, and you can really answer whichever way you do.
Sure.
Now, Prime Minister Modi, when he met President Biden last September, he became the only Prime Minister of India to interact with 3 presidents. And luck will have it, he might even interact with the 4th one, we don't know. Now, if you go by the body language, the personal chemistry, one can say, as his admirers say, his jadoo ki jhappi, which is his magic hug, is still working. It worked very well with Obama. It worked with President Trump. Is working on President Joe Biden. If you go in Washington and also in G20, and may also work on Vice President Kamala Harris. So many will say this is perhaps the best phase which we are seeing in India's relations. We have US again regained position as the largest trading partner. It has displaced Saudi Arabia's second largest supplier of oil. Your defense export have touched $22 billion. We have all more than 300, all the military exercise, Malabar, whatever. And we are now a major defense partner. We are also given SAT-1 status. We are all district partner. All that is good. So everything looks hunky and dory. But if you really analyze a little bit, the trade agreement with President Trump probably is nowhere to be seen. The market taxes, the tariff which were imposed, he called us tariff king, and which are still there. I think GSP withdrawal, we don't know anything. But if you go by the statement of trade representative of the US, they say entire blame lies with the Indian side. I remember when Ambassador Juster was going, Ken Juster, every speech he made in FICCI, CIA, he said entirely blame lies with the Indian side. They have not really shown any sort of initiative to have this agreement on. So you might like to comment on that. Then is question of defense, for example. The defense exports are booming. But last month we had our Ambassador Navtesh Sarna on the same platform. And he was saying, yes, it's going on, but so far as the transfer technology is concerned, it has been a very weak link. There's been very little of transfer technology in defense field. Now, you are a security expert, and we know that US has been giving a lot of intelligence information about handling the terrorists and also even satellite images and all that. But many believe the way the US left Afghanistan, it was to some extent insensitive to India's security concerns. Look at the spike in attacks and all that bound to happen. All these fellows who are roaming around Afghanistan, they start aiming their guns on India, and we don't know how many 100 planes, helicopters, and Humvees are all left there. So I will leave it with you, this thought, just give an overview of current state of India-US relations. As you are a think tank, so I'm sure you will be candid and frank. Over to you.
Thank you, Surendra, and thank you to all my friends who are taking time off to actually participate in this meeting. To all of you, a very happy Diwali. I hope the next year brings peace, happiness, prosperity to all of us. Surendra, let me break up my comments into 2 parts. I want to start by giving you an overview of the relationship, and then I will come back to the defense and issues relating to Afghanistan a little later. Let me just start by giving you a sense of where I think the relationship is.
Okay.
I think when one looks at Prime Minister Modi's visit and what that means as a benchmark for the relationship, I think we can all be actually quite relieved that the relationship is fundamentally in a very good place. This doesn't mean that there are no difficulties, and it doesn't mean that there is no room for even further improvement. But the broad storyline is that the bilateral relationship is valued by both sides and still remains critical. So if you were to ask me, what is the biggest headline positive? I think the headline positive, the positive headline is really that India still remains very important for US interests in Asia and globally, and that this administration, despite all the difficulties, will continue to prioritize the relationship with India. And I think the same is true in New Delhi, that even though India is engaged in, a classic pattern of diversifying its partnerships with others, the United States still stands in a class by itself. And nothing has fundamentally changed on those two counts. Now, having said that, where are the differences? I would flag some differences. Even though there is a very strong convergence between the two countries on issues relating to the Indo-Pacific, on China, on the need to protect the liberal international order. This is all good news. I think the differences in the US emphasis on maritime Asia versus India's concerns about developments in continental Asia, I think this is something to be watched because there is a genuine difference here. The US does not prioritize continental Asia in a way that India would like to see it prioritized. And this has implications for issues relating to terrorism. It has implications for issues relating to Afghanistan, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So that's one area where I do have concerns. A second area is an old area, which is bilateral economic interactions. For all the good news that you pointed out, the US this year is still going to be India's most important economic partner. The fact is, we have different attitudes to trade. We have differences in the way that we think about e-commerce and the digital world. We have differences about how we think about international economic institutions, primarily the WTO and the reform of the WTO. And we have, again, very different attitudes to the mega regionals. The US has, of course, walked out of TPP. I hope that will be revisited. India has declined to join RCEP. So that may seem like a superficial point of convergence. But the point is, there are differences in attitudes to mega regionals in both countries. And last, I would say that the American anxieties about developments in India's domestic politics have not disappeared. But I think it's good that they have not become the centerpiece of the bilateral relationship. So when all is said and done, to me, the relationship is still in a very good place. I think it is important to both countries, and I think that is recognized. But the big challenge that I see for the Biden administration going forward is that this relationship will compete among many other challenges that it is facing. Biden is very concerned about the need to protect American democracy after the Trump experience. He's very focused on rebuilding the middle class, which accounts for the amount of time and energy he's putting into securing these two big bills that are now moving through Congress. To a lesser degree, he has prioritized rebuilding US alliances with our traditional partners. And of course, there is going to be a big push on climate change, where he has gone to Glasgow with a relatively weak hand, and where there are actually some important differences between the United States and India. So it's like a variegated picture, but I would say broadly positive, and it gives us enough room to work constructively, I think, in the years ahead.
Okay, now let me turn to Afghanistan, because that is the place where everything is so uncertain. Now, nobody can really doubt or object to the desire of 4 presidents of USA to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan. All of them have been trying. But the manner in this thing unfolded, the eventual evacuation was nothing short of humiliation. Now, okay, Ghani fled. It was a major factor. Afghanistan Defense Security Forces didn't put a fight. What don't you think, when the US declared a definite date for exit and perhaps withdrew the air cover, there was hardly any ground which the defense forces could have put up. Secondly, everybody knows that the manner, the speed with which Taliban captured the whole country. Pakistan had a role in that. I think you will have more information on that. And do you think that resignation of Khalilzad after all these years is an indirect admission that the agreement reached in Doha under President Trump was a mistake?
Well, there are several issues in your question, Surendra. Let me start by saying that the fact that we announced a departure date and a desire to exit certainly hastened the fall of the Ghani government. But I don't think it caused it. I think the cause of the fall was fundamentally the structural weaknesses of the Afghan government in Kabul and its failure to build a unified political base that would have protected it against the advances of the Taliban. Remember, at the end of the day, we kept the Taliban at bay primarily through US air power and through US forces on the ground. And that's actually an indictment, because if after 20 years, the only thing that came between the Ghani government in Kabul and the Taliban regime was US military power, then it's obvious that we did not do something right with respect to creating the political regime. So when I say the decision to exit did not cause it, I really am underscoring the structural weaknesses of the government that we had placed in Kabul. And the fact that it was unable to earn the loyalty, not only of a large number of Afghans, but also of its own military. Remember, when we talk about a Taliban advance, which was so rapid, that rapidity of advance actually did not have much to do with Pakistan, although Pakistan certainly played a role. The rapidity of the advance derived from the fact that individual stakeholders on the ground were willing to make deals with the advancing Taliban and were willing to shift their loyalty very quickly from the Kabul regime to the Taliban regime. And that tells you something about the character of politics in Afghanistan. Now, when you ask about the Doha Agreement, I thought the Doha Agreement was fundamentally a tragic agreement. But the tragedy of the agreement did not derive from, the various details of the agreement. The tragedy of the agreement derived from the fact that the US government drove a huge disjuncture between the issues of exiting and the character of what was to happen in Afghanistan after the exit. Previously, the two were linked. Prior to President Trump, the issues of the US exit and the future of Afghanistan were linked in all negotiations. What Trump basically did was he broke the connection between those two issues. And he said, all I care about is negotiating exit. And what happens after the exit is over to you. And the moment that connection was broken, then I think what we saw happen in Kabul was simply inevitable. And that, I think, was the real tragedy of the agreement.
Actually, tell me that where does this whole war on terrorism go? The US indirectly helped installation of government to terrorists. You have a cabinet where 15, 14 members are terrorists. Two of them are carrying the award of FBI, I think $10 million and $5 million. What kind of comment? They might have said they won't allow there, but information is that Al-Qaeda is back, ISIS Khorasan is there, and there may be other terrorist groups. So don't you think that war on terrorism has really been affected very adversely?
Well, I'll just say this, Surendra. There is a quite remarkable change in the public mood in the United States about terrorism. The kind of urgency that the war on terrorism had 20 years ago, that urgency has completely disappeared from the American mind. And it is borne out by the fact that despite the tragic images of our exit in Kabul, nobody in American politics fundamentally contests Biden's decision to leave. That decision to leave has, a large measure of majority support. And that essentially tells you that what the American public feels is that the war against terrorism is really an artifact of a different era. And the challenges that the United States faces now are much more complex than the old problem that we had with terrorism. So we will be engaged in some conflict with terrorism, in some pushback against terrorism, but we will do it more and more through law enforcement rather than through military campaigns, through quiet partnerships with our friends. But it is simply not going to be the centerpiece of American foreign policy. And the fact that Afghanistan has ended up the way it is, I think is really a testament to the fact that terrorism does not have that sustaining power as a guiding principle for American foreign policy anymore.
Well, before I ask the next question, you all know Ashley, but still I have got some lines which I must read out about him. Ashley Tellis holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in international security. Additionally, he is the Research Director of the National Bureau of Asian Research Strategic Asia Program and serves as an advisor to the Chief Naval Operations. While in the US government, during George W. Bush administration, he served both in White House and in the State Department, where he was intimately involved in negotiations regarding civil nuclear agreement with India. So he knows India very well. Now, Ashley, you have seen a spike in attacks in Jammu and Kashmir. All the attacks, selected attacks on the community leaders, even attacks on the ordinary workers coming from Bihar, other places. They all have imprint of Pakistan. Now, here is a country which got $40 billion from the US over the years. And it's played a very duplicitous role. It's supporting terrorists, not supporting terrorists, with you, not with you. Don't you think a time has come when US should seriously consider imposing some sort of sanctions on Pakistan?
Well, I think the US relationship with Pakistan now is very different from the relationship that you described when, money was freely flowing and Pakistan and its misdemeanors were overlooked by American policymakers. Today, several months into President Biden's administration, the president has seen fit not to talk, to Prime Minister Imran Khan. And I think that was a considered decision. And it conveys everything that this administration wants to convey, which is that we will try to have as good a relationship with Pakistan as circumstances allow, but we are not going to bend backwards to subsidize Pakistan's pathologies. The position that the United States has taken, for example, on terrorism financing and the efforts that we have made to keep Pakistan, on the gray list, not give it a pass, I think should tell you everything, on this question. The days of, sort of untrammeled assistance to Pakistan are over. And Pakistan simply does not have the priority that it once had in American diplomacy.
One more question on Pakistan. Pakistan has been aspiring for getting a strategic depth in Afghanistan. Has at last got it? So they feel so. And don't you think that sooner than later, Taliban and Pakistan might fall out and they might have to bear the brunt of terrorists based in Afghanistan against it?
I think that's absolutely right. In fact, my own view is that Pakistan may regret the manner it has acquired its strategic depth, which is one reason why Pakistan was actually not comfortable with the idea of a Taliban takeover in the way that it did. What it wanted early on was a negotiated settlement where the Taliban would have disproportionate power, but where it would not remain the sole power in Kabul, precisely for the reasons that you identify, that Taliban interests and Pakistan interests converge on several issues, but they are not entirely identical. And the one thing that Pakistan hoped that the Taliban would deliver in the last iteration when it was in government, which was a clear recognition of the Durand Line as the international border, That was the one issue that the Taliban absolutely refused to give Pakistan, even when they were in power in the 1990s. And so, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are other issues relating to Pashtun nationalism and so on and so forth, where there are deep divisions between the Taliban and Pakistan. So this is not an unvarnished good where Pakistan is concerned. And so we will have to continue to watch the relations between Rawalpindi and Kabul, in the months ahead.
Well, talking about the global role, the leadership role of the US, after Doha Agreement, which basically capitulation or surrender to Taliban and the manner in which they evacuated, and the fact that US was not able to defeat a ragtag terrorist group called Taliban 20 years after sinking nearly $3 trillion and having lost nearly 3,000 soldiers' lives. Now, do you think the global leadership role, the capacity of the US to offer that role has been dented seriously?
I don't personally think so. I mean, we have gone through reverses of this kind before. I mean, people ask the same question, after the catastrophe in Vietnam, and the United States still staged a comeback. The structural power of the United States in the global system has not been affected by the fact that, we left Afghanistan in such an embarrassing way. To me, the bigger problems about the global role have less to do with Afghanistan and the failures in Afghanistan. It has to do fundamentally with domestic politics in the United States. That is, will the American people continue supporting a leadership role of the kind that we exercised for most of the Cold War? I think there is reason to doubt that the American people in their entirety are actually supportive of that role today. And that's really, I think, the issue that President Biden is grappling with, trying to build the domestic foundations back for a continued American leadership role, because it is entirely possible that we will remain powerful in an absolute sense and yet lack the political will to undertake the burdens of leadership, simply because domestic politics will not permit the President of the United States to play that role. In that sense, the forces that Donald Trump tapped into are very powerful social forces in the United States. And I think that is really what Biden is grappling with. So when you think of the future of the United States in global politics, I am more cautious only because I see domestic transformations that are not always very supportive of that global role. Not because we have any weakness or because, our credibility has been dented in any substantial sense.
Well, the G7 leaders, the QUAD, and many other democratic countries keep on shouting a rooftop about how important democracy, human rights, and we must really work. But what should the Afghan people feel? The whole world has left them at the mercy of Taliban, the antithesis of democracy and human rights. I mean, there is just no way. So this whole image that you are protectors of democracy looks very sham and shallow. You remember when Iraq invasion, that time also the slogans went that democracy will flourish from Baghdad to Aden, and you know what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria. There's no trace of democracy. So do you think this whole talk about democracy is more rhetoric than real action?
No, I think it is more an aspiration rather than anything else. I mean, the bottom line is this. Democracy is very important as part of our, global vision of ourselves. But the question is, what price are you willing to pay? And when it comes to Afghanistan in particular, my suspicion is that we have some leverage, but not an enormous amount of leverage. And the decisions that the United States and its partners will have to make with respect to the recognition of the Taliban regime, with respect to financial assistance, with respect to removing the UNSCR sanctions, particularly on the travel of the Taliban leaders. All these, if employed sort of adroitly, might shape their decisions in some ways. But honestly, I'm not very optimistic because, the leadership in Kabul today is composed primarily of extremists. These are ideologically motivated individuals who, having suffered for 40 years, have no compunctions about, forcing their country to suffer for another 40, simply because of the choices that they are prepared to make, which are all ideological choices. So, as I said before, I think what happened in Afghanistan is truly tragic. We have some instruments that may make a difference on the margins, but I suspect only on the margins.
But over the last few years, India, US have come closer. British science very close, perhaps the closest ever. Many cynics say that this whole the warmth between India and US is directly proportionate to the tension between US and China. The more tension there is, the closer you come to India. Now, do you really buy this kind of cynical view?
Well, this is a great application of Kautilya's, strategy in the Arthashastra. But I want to make a larger point, though. There is an element of truth to that. There's no question that to the degree that US-China relations are troubled and India-China relations are troubled, it creates great incentives for the United States and India to grow closer. But look back at the formation when US-India relations began to deepen, which was in the last years of the Clinton administration and in the 8 years of the Bush administration. The incentives at that time were somewhat different. We focused on deepening the relationship with India because we wanted to prevent China from becoming a troublesome entity. So it was not premised on the assumption that our relations with China were going to be troubled. Our relationship with India was meant to be part of an environment shaping exercise that would channel Chinese ambitions and Chinese directions in certain productive ways. Now, obviously, we were not entirely successful there because after Xi Jinping took power, he decided that this was time for China to, make its claims in the sun. And now we are coping with the consequences of that Xi Jinping policy. But the fact of the matter is, China poses a direct challenge to American interests, to Indian interests. And it will certainly bring us closer together because we do need to find better ways of limiting China's capacity to, undermine the system, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, the system that protects both our interests.
Well, continuing with China, the China phobia seems to be driving force behind the energized profile of Indo-Pacific, the QUAD and now the AUKUS. Is it a strong enough glue to keep all the stakeholders together, given the fact that several members have huge economic dependence on China? Just last week, as many 69 countries in the UN supported China on the question of Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang.
So you raised a very important question. I don't think any of the members of the US-led coalitions, and there are a variety of them which you point out, have yet broken the code. We have not found the magic formula of what it requires to compete with China while also cooperating with it economically. The fact of the matter is China is going to be an enormously difficult power to compete with because it is economically powerful and economically interdependent with many countries in a way that the former Soviet Union was not. And the United States and India, neither of us have actually broken the code. Neither of us have found what the perfect solution is for competing with a country that you also happen to have strong economic links with. So I think this dilemma is going to remain with us for a long time, and it will affect all the coalitions that you identified. There is no escape.
Okay, we all agree that China must curb its assertiveness, aggressiveness, and must abide by international laws in South China Sea, Indo-Pacific, and desist from intimidating her neighbors, nor resort to incursion as it did last against India. But is an all-out campaign to demonize China is helpful maintaining peace and security in the world?
Well, we are not in the business of demonizing China. I mean, Xi Jinping has done a remarkably good job all by himself in conveying the image of a China that is demonic. We are simply coping with the realities of a China that is behaving demonic. The United States did not set out to provoke China. The United States has been China's greatest supporter and sponsor for some 40 years, going back to the early 1980s. So no one can accuse us of demonizing China. I think China has essentially become very powerful, and it wants to use that power to secure interests that it believes are, rightfully its own. But those interests happen to undermine the interests of others, including the security of our Asian partners and our friends like India. So we have to find strategies that will allow us to limit China's capacity to harm those interests. And that's what it's all about.
Indian strategic thinkers don't agree with your friend Fareed Zakaria's view that we are living in an undeclared Cold War era. Former Indian National Security Advisor Shivkanta Menon recently said at a discussion that it isn't unipolar world, nor a bipolar world, nor even multipolar world. It is a world adrift between orders. Even if President Biden gets trillions of dollars he is seeking from the Congress, can his Build Back Better vision stall China's rise to number Is China's rise to the top not necessarily such a bad news?
Well, there are two questions there. The first is, are we living in an undeclared Cold War? And I think the answer is yes. We are living in an undeclared Cold War, but it's a very unique kind of a Cold War. It's not what the first Cold War was, where you had competition between two major blocs that had no economic linkages with each other. This new Cold War is strategic competition between two blocs that are deeply economically interlinked. And we are still in the process of devising rules for this competition. And my suspicion is that we will never be satisfied with the solutions that we will develop, because there will never be clean solutions of the kind that we had during the first Cold War. So this is going to be a perpetual struggle to come up with a strategy that is effective and satisfying to compete with someone who is simultaneously your adversary as he is your economic partner. The second question on whether we are in between orders or whether we are actually moving towards bipolarity, I have a difference in view there with my friend Ambassador Menon. I think we are moving towards a new bipolarity. I think Shankar Menon's description of the international system takes its bearings too much from the complexity of the system and does not pay sufficient attention to its deep structure. I think the deep structure is quite clear to me, which is that you are going to enter a period of new bipolarity because the capabilities of the United States and the capabilities of China are going to stand head and shoulders above all other states in the international system. And I think that is actually a description of bipolarity. Now, in this process, again, the objective is not to prevent China from rising. We have been the greatest supporters of China's rise, as I pointed out. The question is, how do you prevent a rising power from using its newfound capabilities to undermine the interests and the security of others? That is the question that I think the United States and India have to face together, along with its other partners like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, the Philippines, you name it, and also our European partners, because this is something that's also going to affect them as well. I don't think we should succumb to the Chinese claim that this competition that is evolving is part of a Western-led strategy to stymie China's rise. Not at all. It's not about stymieing the rise. It's about protecting ourselves against aggressive Chinese behavior. That's an entirely different problem. And I think that's a problem we need to keep ourselves focused on.
Well, Leslie, I have questions, but I think I will make it more interactive. I will stop here and invite questions from our attending guest friends. Ambassador Vishnu has really shown interest asking questions, but I also see before Vishnu, 1 minute, let me, because the China has been mentioned so many times, we have the senior most diplomat on the list here, Ambassador Eric Gonsalves, who has handled China for many, many years. Ambassador Gonsalves, are you there? Ambassador Gonsalves, sir.
Yes, I'm here.
So we will welcome your comments, sir. You have been very patiently hearing. Then Vishnu number.
No, I don't think it's very clear which way one is going, because it won't be bipartisan in a sense. The Chinese seem to have developed a system in which they are capable of managing their domestic politics better than the Americans can. And I think that this is going to be the real problem. Initially, the whole idea of democracy, the market, technology, and so on, seemed to give the Americans and their allies an overwhelming superiority. And they were able to deal with the Soviets and, in a sense, use the Chinese as allies. But I don't think that they will be able to do the same thing to the Chinese that they did to the Soviets. The Chinese, I think, are beyond that. Chinese have their weaknesses, there's no doubt. There is a certain internal problem, but I think the American domestic politics is their greatest problem at the moment, because it is not allied in any way to the manager of power. It's really a sort of, it's really a pandemic of sort of abusing each other, and there's a sort of poison in the atmosphere. So I think if that goes on, we're going to look for a world in which we're going to have to deal more with the Chinese and forget the Americans. Thank you.
Okay, Vishnu, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Tellis, thank you for the perspective. Two small questions. One, Pakistan. Even if we do not accept India's narrative and go by American perspective, it's very clear that Pakistan has played both sides and hurt American interests. That being so, what is the hold that Pakistan has on the US, or what is the US calculus in that US is very reluctant to hold Pakistan's feet to fire? So that is one. And on China, is the Biden administration ambivalent? Somehow one gets a sense that they are still not sure whether to engage, not to engage, how far to go. And when we say that, there is no interest in containing China, point is that the US support and economic development in China has led to military aggression. So there is a direct linkage between Chinese economic power and military aggression.
Two very good questions. I think it's not a question of the hold that Pakistan has on the United States. I think the problem started out because we were pursuing two objectives that were in tension with each other. We were trying to defeat Al-Qaeda, and the Pakistani state was supportive of that objective of defeating Al-Qaeda. And later on, we also attempted to defeat the Taliban, and the Pakistani state was happy to undercut that effort at defeating the Taliban. So there were two objectives that were in tension with each other. The United States prioritized for the longest time, the extirpation of Al-Qaeda. And because that was our priority, we allowed Pakistan to get away with its strategy of undercutting our military campaign against the Taliban. Now, if we had a singular objective, I think those tensions would have disappeared. But because we had objectives that were in tension with each other, at least where Pakistan was concerned, Pakistan was able to play one objective against the other. And at the end of the day, I would say both of us succeeded. I mean, it's ironic, but it's true. We succeeded in destroying Al-Qaeda with Pakistan's help. And Pakistan succeeded in frustrating the United States with respect to defeating the Taliban. So there was a peculiar kind of an equilibrium, which, we are going to be living with, the realities of which we are going to be living with for a long, long time to come. On China, I agree with you completely that we helped China grow. We are now dealing with the consequences of how China is applying that improved or that increased economic growth for certain military ends. And there are two solutions in principle. One is to be able to prevent China from being able to apply its power militarily. In other words, to prevent it from using its resources to undercut our strategic interests. And we are beginning to do that in a very serious way. And my suspicion is that we will actually succeed on that front, because that is an issue we know how to do well. We know how to defeat countries that use military resources. There is a second element, which is there a strategy now for constraining China's growth and limiting its capacity to grow in ways that undermine our interests? And I fear on that count, we haven't found the magic formula. So we know what parts we have to pay attention to. So we are putting in place a denial regime with respect to China's access to high technology. You can see that in the way we've conducted business with Huawei, 5G, artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to technology denial, I think the United States is sort of moving in a quite focused way. But what does it mean for other forms of economic intercourse with China? I don't think we have the answer to that. And so I think this is going to be a dilemma and a debate within the United States for some time to come, which is, what is the limit of your competition with China? How far are you prepared to go? Are you prepared to go to the point where you become functionally autonomous of China economically? Are you prepared to sort of break all the bonds of interdependence that you have built over the last 40 years? Are you prepared to just do this selectively? Or do you simply say, we can't prevent interdependence, we live with it, but we simply find alternatives to that interdependence? And that is through these mega regionals like TPP and so on and so forth. So those are the issues that are really being debated today, in the American strategic community. But it's not going to be an easy answer, whatever that answer is.
Thank you very much.
Adding to that, Ashley, President Trump urged all the American companies, more than 25,000 of them in China, to come back to US. How many companies really returned? And same over alternative sources, supply chains. Now, how many supply chains have come up in the last 3 years?
Now, that was a silly policy from the moment of its conception. Mm-hmm. American companies are not beholden to the American government. American companies will go where there is money to be made. And if there is money to be made in China, they will go to China. And unless the United States is prepared to use extraordinary sovereign powers, and those extraordinary sovereign powers are usually found only in wartime, there is no way the President of the United States can either induce or compel the many thousands of American companies that operate in China to come back. So where does this leave us? To my mind, we do have vulnerabilities of the supply chain because of the trends that have taken place in the global economy. Manufacturing is now China's strong suit. Many American companies do their business and earn their survival by being based in China. The solution, to my mind, cannot be asking them to come back, because they won't. They won't come back. The solution, to my mind, is diversifying the supply chain by creating incentives for American companies to operate in locations other than China. And this is where, countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, India become really interesting alternatives. But again, at the end of the day, the US government cannot force these companies to go to these countries. The economic environment in these countries has to be appealing enough for companies to find it worth their while to move there. So we can encourage, we can cajole, we can even create sort of some financial incentives. But at the end of the day, these are decisions going to be made by profit-making entities. And unless the environment in these countries, which are competitors to China, is not conducive enough, these companies will simply not go. So I thought the Trump policy on this question was just plain silly to begin with, because it was completely out of sync with the economic realities of the modern world.
Among the attendees, I see the name of the Director General of IDSA. Is Sujan Chinoy there? Sujan, are you there? Hello?
Oh, yes, of course, indeed.
Yes,
thank you.
I think the DGIDSA should have a question or comment.
Well, I think Ashley, as usual, was at his brilliant best. And I might pay the same compliment to you, Ambassador Surendra Kumar. You, in my view, have an alternative career that begins today.
Begins today? I think you have been missing all my discussions for last.
No, but you are at your very best when you're with the best of the lot, which is Ashley Tellis. So, but I might just ask Ashley one point here, which is that the extraction from Afghanistan, will it in any manner lead to, either in military terms or in broad geostrategic terms, a recommitment to the Indo-Pacific in terms of resources? This is what I'm interested in. Does it free up a lot that the US otherwise might have been running around to find, which will now be more readily available, provided, of course, that there is a steady commitment to devote resources. And I think that commitment has been made by President Biden. So will it now be backed by a very pleasant availability of extra resources, militarily especially?
I think that's a very good question, Sujan, and the answer is yes and no. And let me explain what I mean by that. The administration will certainly apply more resources to the Indo-Pacific, because everyone knows that that region has been starved of resources commensurate to the challenges that we face. So the Pacific Reassurance Initiative, which Congress has funded, will be plussed up in the years to come. The force structure that we have in the Indo-PACOM Theater of Command will be plussed up in the years to come, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the yes part of the answer. What's the no part of the answer? The no part of the answer is that there are so many other competing domestic priorities that it's very hard to give you a clean yes. In other words, it's very hard to say that the $25 billion or so that we were spending annually in Afghanistan will simply, by the fact of being now freed up, be applied without any qualifications to the Indo-Pacific. So if that's the expectation, the answer is no. You are not going to see a plus up of Indo-Pacific resources to the extent of $25 billion simply because we happen to save that in Afghanistan. Remember what the Biden administration is trying to do. It's trying to do two things simultaneously. It's trying to help us compete with China in a military sense in the way that I described. But of even greater priority to Biden is actually rebuilding America's democracy and resuscitating the American middle class. Because I think he is truly of the view, and I share this view, he is truly of the view that if American democracy weakens from within, there will be no appetite for America maintaining its global role. And that if the American middle class fractures and weakens as it has been over the last 30 years, then the political leadership in the United States will simply not have the domestic support to maintain its international activism. And that's really the lesson of the Trump era. What Trump showed us was that there was a good 40 to 45% of the electorate who simply felt that they were left out of the benefits that came from America's involvement in the world. And it is this 45% of the electorate which is basically telling America's leaders, in effect, forget about the world, focus only on America. And what Biden is trying to do is to satisfy this constituency sufficiently enough in order that the United States may be able to maintain its traditional role of global leadership. And, that's an expensive proposition. I mean, you cannot satisfy, 45% of your electorate.
It's $25 billion.
$25 billion.
Chump change for that, yes.
Yep, absolutely. It's chump change. It's an accounting error, right? And that's why it's not surprising that Biden's two bills, the infrastructure bill and the social security bill, runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. So there is a yes and no answer to your question, Sujan. But the key point to keep in mind is this, and this is something that our allies should not lose sight of, that the United States will make the investments required to maintain its military preeminence in the Indo-Pacific. Because there is a very clear understanding that if we lose that military preeminence, we lose the network of friends and alliances. And if we lose the network of friends and alliances, then we have in effect ceded the entire Indo-Pacific space as a Chinese sphere of influence. And that, of course, would be completely unacceptable from the point of view of our global interest.
If I could try Ambassador Surendra Kumar's patience with just one quick add-on question, is what took the United States so long to understand that the way to deny China its rise and aggressive role on the geostrategic stage was essentially to deny its economic rise? And the United States had all the means to do so much earlier on. What exactly prevented such cerebral people in the United States from cottoning on to this very basic fact 20 years earlier?
Remember Churchill's great line about the United States. You can always count on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted all other alternatives, right? So that, I think, sort of explains it in a nutshell. But most seriously, the fundamental reason why this could not have been done was because of the state-society cleavages within the United States. There were large sections of American elites, particularly business, which profited from the relationship with China. These are powerful elites in the American democratic process. When you are wealthy, you have privileged access to all this, all the councils of power. And it was these elites who basically said, what's the problem with China getting rich if we are getting rich at the same time? And the questions of power were simply pushed to the sidelines. Now, we were helped at that time by the fact that it was the China of Deng Xiaoping, which was not interested in assertiveness for various reasons of its own. So the Chinese desire to hide and bide matched perfectly with the American desire to make profits of China. And that's really what prevented the American state from really intervening and crafting a policy that was more competitive to China than, at that time. And now that is changed. Now that has fundamentally changed because Chinese assertiveness and the fact that American state interests are now implicated by China's assertiveness, which are allowing the government to push back on business and other constituencies that might otherwise wanted to restore the status quo ante.
Okay, I will let you go exactly 60 minutes, but let me squeeze one question. In this whole discussion, we have left out Russia. Thanks to all the sanctions imposed on Russia by US and Western countries, we are pushing Russia closer to China. Now, do you think the Chinese and Russian axis can be very formidable opposition to US?
Well, two points there. First, we have genuine issues with Russia, which we cannot simply pretend do not exist. And the fundamental issue is this. Russia wants to recreate its near abroad as its exclusive sphere of influence. That is simply something that the United States today cannot accept because many of those countries in Russia's near abroad are now our allies or are very close to the United States and are deeply threatened by Moscow. So there is an objective tension in our interests, which we simply cannot pretend does not exist. So it's not a question of us doing things that is pushing Russia towards China. We are doing things that are consistent with our conception of our interests, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. And that, unfortunately, has the inadvertent consequence of increasing US-Russian animosity and the consequence of bringing the Chinese and the Russians together. We can work on the margins to mitigate that. And I think the Biden administration is trying, which is why, there has been an outreach to Moscow and so on and so forth. But I don't think we can change those fundamental structural contradictions without sacrificing the allies that we have in Eastern Europe. And if we were to sacrifice those allies, then the damage done to America's credibility, reputation, and its bigger role in the world, its larger role in the world, I think would be very profound.
Thank you very much, Ashley. You have been brilliant, incisive, and as usual, very frank and candid. I appreciate, and I appreciate the fact that you are so busy, still you agreed to come on. I will ask my old friend who are attending here to give you a round of applause virtually. And we hope to see you maybe next time when you come. We will not be having virtually, but we'll have the pleasure of having you in some hall. Thank you very much. Wish you happy Diwali and New Year in advance. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon. I'm tired of Zoom myself. So God bless you all. Have a wonderful
anyway, you are
festival
not late for next. You are not late for next appointment. I let you go exactly a few minutes before.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.